Carl Jung discovered something that will completely reframe how you understand empathic pain. He found that the very thing empaths are told to protect themselves from, deep emotional suffering, is actually the catalyst for developing what I call psychological invincibility. Most people believe empaths are fragile. Society teaches you that feeling deeply makes you weak, that absorbing others' emotions leaves you vulnerable. But Jung's research revealed the opposite. Empaths who learn to alchemize their pain don't just recover from it. They become untouchable. Here's what Jung understood that changes everything. When an empath experiences intense emotional pain and consciously processes it, they develop a form of inner strength that can't be broken by external circumstances. They forge what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing forces in tension until something entirely new emerges. This isn't about healing your wounds so you can return to who you were before. This is about using those wounds as raw material to become someone more powerful than you ever imagined possible. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your pain isn't your weakness. It's your ultimate power source. But here's what makes this discovery so revolutionary. Most therapeutic approaches treat empathic sensitivity as something to manage, control, or protect. Jung saw it differently. He understood that empaths aren't broken people who need fixing. They're alchemists in training who need the right framework. The question isn't how to feel less or protect yourself from pain. The question is how to transform suffering into strength, vulnerability into power, wounds into wisdom. Jung spent decades studying this process, and what he discovered will challenge everything you've been told about empathic nature. Think about every moment you've absorbed someone else's pain, every time you felt too much, every wound that cut deeper than it should have. What if all of that wasn't damage? What if it was preparation for something extraordinary? Jung revolutionized psychology when he studied medieval alchemy, not as primitive chemistry, but as a symbolic map for psychological transformation. He discovered that alchemists weren't just trying to turn lead into gold. They were documenting the process of transforming the base matter of human suffering into the gold of consciousness. For empaths, this alchemical process begins with what Jung called the nigredo, the blackening phase. This is when you're drowning in others' emotions, absorbing pain you can't process, feeling crushed under the weight of sensitivities you didn't ask for. Most people try to escape this phase. Immediately, they build walls, shut down their empathy, or numb themselves. But Jung discovered something crucial. If you try to skip the nigredo, you never access the transformation it offers. The darkness isn't the problem, avoiding it is. Consider a narrative illustration that demonstrates this principle clearly. Imagine an empath who spent years absorbing her family's unspoken trauma. She felt her mother's depression before her mother acknowledged it. She carried her father's anxiety like it was her own nervous system. By her 20s, she was emotionally exhausted, convinced her empathy was a curse. Traditional therapy told her to set boundaries, to protect her energy, to care less. But when she encountered Jung's work, she realized she'd been approaching her empathy backwards. The goal wasn't to feel less. It was to consciously process what she felt so deeply that it transformed both her and the pain itself. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." For empaths, this isn't just philosophical wisdom, it's operational instruction. Your pain isn't random suffering, it's the heat of the alchemist's forge, burning away everything false until only truth remains. Here's where most people misunderstand the empathic experience. They think empaths are like sponges, helplessly absorbing whatever's around them. But Jung saw empaths as crucibles, containers strong enough to hold intense psychological material while it undergoes transformation. When you absorb someone's anger, you're not just carrying their emotion. You're providing the space for that anger to be witnessed, processed, and potentially transformed. When you feel someone's grief, you're not just experiencing their loss. You're demonstrating that grief can be held without destroying the one who holds it. This is why empathic pain feels so intense. You're not just processing your own experiences. You're processing the raw psychological material of everyone around you. Jung understood that this capacity, when developed consciously, becomes extraordinary power. But there's a critical transition point that determines whether your empathy destroys you or transforms you. And that transition begins with understanding the difference between unconscious absorption and conscious alchemy. Here's the controversy that Jung's work creates, and why many therapeutic approaches still resist this truth. Empaths who embrace their pain consciously become stronger than people who never felt deeply in the first place. This contradicts everything modern psychology teaches about emotional regulation and self-protection. The standard advice is to minimize exposure to painful emotions, to establish rigid boundaries, to limit how much you feel. But Jung's research with deeply sensitive individuals revealed a different pattern. We see this dynamic clearly in composite case profiles based on strictly observed patterns. Consider the trajectory of an empath who experienced profound emotional trauma in childhood. She developed the ability to read every micro-expression, to sense danger before it manifested, to feel others' emotions as clearly as her own thoughts. Most therapists would call this hypervigilance and try to reduce it. But Jung would recognize this as advanced psychological perception. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. A survival skill that became a superpower. When this individual learned to work with her sensitivity instead of against it, she didn't just cope with life. She developed what I call emotional invincibility, the ability to walk into any psychological space without being overwhelmed by it. Here's what Jung understood that changes everything. Empaths don't need to feel less. They need to develop what he called the container, psychological structures strong enough to hold intense emotional material without being consumed by it. Think about how metal is forged. You don't create strength by protecting the metal from heat. You create strength by exposing it to intense temperatures while maintaining structural integrity. The heat transforms the molecular structure, creating bonds that can withstand enormous pressure. Empathic pain works the same way. Every time you consciously hold someone else's suffering without collapsing into it, you're strengthening your psychological structure. Every time you feel deeply and maintain your center, you're building what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in tension. But let's address the resistance this idea creates. People say, "But I'm exhausted from feeling too much. How can that possibly make me stronger?" Jung's answer would challenge your assumptions about what strength actually means. Traditional strength is about resistance, building walls, shutting down, protecting yourself from external forces. But Jung identified a more sophisticated form of strength, resilience through integration. This is the strength that comes from being able to encounter any psychological material and transform it. Imagine someone who's never been challenged telling someone who survived a crucible that they need to be more careful. The survivor knows something the comfortable person doesn't. When you've walked through fire and emerged intact, you develop a certainty that can't be shaken by circumstances. This is the untouchable quality that empaths develop through conscious pain processing. You become someone who can witness any emotion without being destroyed by it, hold any psychological tension without fracturing, walk into any situation knowing you have the internal resources to handle whatever emerges. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, complete self-acceptance means embracing both your extraordinary sensitivity and the strength forged through it. Now we arrive at Jung's most provocative insight about empathic development. When you learn to consciously work with your pain, your empathy transforms from a vulnerability into what I call weaponized discernment. This isn't about using empathy to harm others. It's about developing precision-level perception that allows you to see through deception, manipulation, and false personas instantly. Jung called this capacity seeing the shadow in others, the ability to recognize what people hide, deny, or suppress. Here's how this works psychologically. When you've processed your own pain consciously, you develop an internal database of emotional signatures. You know what grief feels like in every variation. You recognize anger disguised as concern. You can sense fear masked as confidence. You become fluent in the language of authentic emotion versus performed emotion. Let's examine a narrative illustration that demonstrates this clearly. Consider the profile of an empath who spent years in a relationship with someone who presented as emotionally available but was actually deeply defended. She kept feeling a disconnect between his words and his energy, but she couldn't articulate it. After leaving that relationship and doing deep work on her own pain patterns, something shifted. She could suddenly identify emotional incongruence in seconds. When someone said, "I'm fine," but their energy screamed distress, she didn't just sense it. She could name the specific flavor of what they were hiding. When someone presented as confident but was compensating for deep insecurity, she could see the mechanism of the compensation. This isn't magic or mysticism. Jung would explain this as pattern recognition operating at advanced levels. Your empathic system has been absorbing emotional data your entire life. When you process your own pain consciously, you develop the clarity to read others' patterns accurately. But here's where this becomes truly powerful. Most people can be manipulated because they want to believe the story someone presents. Empaths who have processed their pain don't have this vulnerability. They've felt every variety of false comfort, witnessed every form of emotional theater. They're immune to manipulation because they can sense inauthenticity immediately. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." When you've faced your own soul through conscious pain processing, you recognize instantly when others are avoiding theirs. You see the defense mechanisms, the persona performance, the shadow projections. This creates what I call empathic sovereignty, the ability to interact with others without being pulled into their unconscious dramas. You can witness someone's pain without taking it on. You can recognize someone's manipulation without being affected by it. You can see through false personas without needing to expose them. This is the shift from empathic vulnerability to empathic power. You're no longer a sponge absorbing whatever comes your way. You're a detector, a translator, a consciousness that can read psychological reality with precision. If you've developed the ability to sense deception immediately, comment, "I see what others hide." Jung spent decades studying the process he called individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness. For empaths, this journey has specific stages that transform pain into power. Let me reveal the exact process Jung identified. Stage 1. Conscious recognition. The first stage is recognizing that you're empathic. Absorption isn't random. Jung discovered that empaths unconsciously absorb the emotional material they need to process in themselves. When you constantly encounter angry people, you're being forced to examine your relationship with anger. When you attract wounded people, you're being shown your own unhealed wounds. This stage requires radical honesty. You have to stop seeing yourself as a victim of others' emotions and start seeing yourself as someone unconsciously drawn to specific emotional patterns for a reason. Jung called this owning your projection, recognizing that the external world mirrors your internal landscape. Stage 2. Active processing. Once you recognize the pattern, the second stage involves what Jung called active imagination, consciously working with the emotional material you've absorbed. This isn't about analyzing it intellectually. It's about letting the emotions move through you while maintaining witness consciousness. We can observe this principle through composite case profiles. Consider an empath who absorbs others' anxiety constantly. Instead of trying to discharge the anxiety or distract from it, she learns to sit with it, explore it, understand its message. She asks, what is this anxiety trying to protect? What fear lives beneath it? What wisdom does it carry? Through this process, the anxiety stops being something foreign she's carrying and becomes information she's processing. The transformation happens not through elimination, but through integration. The anxiety reveals layers of human experience that deepen her understanding of both herself and others. Stage 3. Boundary alchemy. Jung understood that psychological boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. The third stage involves developing what I call conscious permeability. You learn to be open to emotional information while maintaining your center. You can feel someone's pain without it becoming your pain. You can sense someone's fear without it activating your fear response. This stage creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing energies in tension. You're simultaneously open and protected, empathic and sovereign, available and untouchable. This paradox is the signature of mastery. Stage 4. Transmutation. The final stage is where your processed pain becomes wisdom you can offer others. Jung wrote, "The wounded healer is the archetype of human transformation. When you've consciously transformed your suffering, you become capable of guiding others through similar transformations." But this isn't about becoming everyone's therapist. It's about embodying a frequency that automatically elevates consciousness around you. People sense they can be authentic with you because you've been authentic with yourself. They recognize they can explore their shadows with you because you've integrated yours. This is the completion of the alchemical process. From unconscious absorption to conscious processing to transmuted wisdom. Your pain doesn't just heal, it becomes medicine for collective consciousness. Here's where Jung's work becomes revolutionary, and where most empaths experience the most resistance. The goal isn't healing your empathic wounds. The goal is using those wounds as portals to a completely different way of being. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for empaths, becoming who you truly are means accepting that you'll never fit into the boxes society creates for normal emotional functioning. Your nervous system isn't designed for superficial interaction. Your psyche isn't wired for shallow connection. Your soul isn't satisfied with comfortable lies. The climax of empathic development is the moment when you stop trying to be less sensitive and start owning your sensitivity as evolutionary advantage. This isn't about pride or superiority. It's about recognizing that your capacity to feel deeply serves a purpose larger than your personal comfort. Consider a narrative illustration that brings this into sharp focus. Imagine an empath who spent decades trying to heal her sensitivity, as if being empathic was a wound. She meditated to feel less. She set boundaries to experience less. She developed strategies to protect herself from emotional overwhelm, and all of it kept her trapped in the belief that her empathy was the problem. The breakthrough came when she encountered Jung's concept of the wounded healer. She realized her wounds weren't obstacles to overcome. They were initiations into a form of consciousness most people never access. Her pain had cracked her open in ways that revealed dimensions of human experience others couldn't perceive. At that moment, everything shifted. She stopped trying to heal her empathy and started developing it as a skill. She studied how emotions move through systems. She learned to track psychological patterns across generations. She discovered that her sensitivity wasn't a bug in her programming. It was her programming's most sophisticated feature. Jung observed that people who embrace their psychological complexity become what he called conscious individuals, people who live from authentic self-knowledge rather than social conditioning. For empaths, this means recognizing that your depth isn't something to apologize for. It's something to cultivate. The empowered empath in 2026 looks nothing like the stereotypical wounded healer who sacrifices themselves for others. They're psychologically sovereign, emotionally precise, and interpersonally untouchable. They've transformed their sensitivity from a vulnerability others exploit into a superpower others can't penetrate. This is the shift from empathic suffering to empathic mastery. And it requires accepting something most people resist. Your pain was never the problem. Your resistance to your pain was the problem. Jung's final insight about empathic development will completely transform how you understand your journey. When you fully integrate your pain, you don't just become strong, you become untouchable. Not untouchable in the sense of being cold or disconnected. Untouchable in the sense that external circumstances can no longer destabilize your internal state. You've walked through so much fire that regular heat doesn't affect you. You've processed so much pain that typical suffering doesn't overwhelm you. You've integrated so much shadow that others' projections bounce off you. Jung called this state psychological wholeness, the integration of all aspects of self into coherent consciousness. For empaths, wholeness means embracing both your extraordinary sensitivity and the diamond-hard strength forged through conscious pain processing. Let's be specific about what this looks like in practice. The untouchable empath can walk into a room full of chaos and remain centered. They can witness someone's breakdown without absorbing it. They can hold space for intense emotion without being overwhelmed by it. They can sense manipulation without being affected by it. This isn't dissociation or detachment. It's mastery. You're fully present, deeply feeling, completely aware, and absolutely sovereign. You've developed what Jung called the self with a capital S, the organizing center of psyche that exists beyond ego identification. Here's the pattern that emerges when empaths complete this transformation. They stop attracting wounded people who want to be saved because they're no longer unconsciously seeking validation through rescuing others. They stop experiencing empathic exhaustion because they've learned to process emotional material in real time rather than storing it. They stop being manipulated because they can see psychological games clearly. Most importantly, they discover that their empathy becomes more refined, not less sensitive. Jung understood that consciousness doesn't eliminate feeling, it clarifies it. When you're no longer drowning in unconscious absorption, you can perceive emotional truth with laser precision. We see this principle clearly in observed patterns across individuals who complete this development. They report being able to read people's authentic intentions within minutes of meeting them. They describe sensing when someone is living authentically versus performing a role. They explain that they can feel the quality of consciousness in a space before anyone speaks. This is empathy that has evolved from liability to asset, from wound to weapon, from vulnerability to invincibility. And Jung recognized this as evidence of consciousness development that serves not just individual growth but collective evolution. Your pain processed consciously becomes wisdom that elevates everyone you encounter. Your wounds integrated completely become portals through which others can glimpse their own healing. Your empathy mastered fully becomes a frequency that transforms consciousness wherever you go. Carl Jung discovered that empathic pain isn't something to eliminate, protect against, or minimize. It's the crucible through which extraordinary consciousness is forged. Every moment you felt too much, absorbed too deeply, or carried pain that wasn't yours has been preparing you for this transformation. The alchemist's crucible doesn't just heat metal, it transforms its molecular structure, creating bonds that can withstand pressures the original material could never handle. Your empathic pain has been doing the same thing to your psyche. Every conscious encounter with suffering has been strengthening psychological structures, deepening perceptual capacity, and forging the untouchable core that defines empathic mastery. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." You're not defined by the pain you've absorbed or the wounds you've carried. You're defined by what you consciously choose to do with that raw material. The empowered empath doesn't heal their sensitivity and return to normal. They alchemize their sensitivity and transcend normal completely. They become living demonstrations of consciousness development, walking proof that depth isn't weakness and feeling isn't fragility. Your pain is your power. Your wounds are your wisdom. Your empathy is your evolutionary edge. Stop apologizing for feeling deeply and start weaponizing your depth for conscious impact. If this journey resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in this process of transformation, comment below, "My pain is my power." Let's build a community of empaths who understand that we're not here to fit into the world's definition of normal. We're here to demonstrate what's possible beyond normal. Your depth isn't your damage, it's your destiny. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get the Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.